I'm just so thrilled to be with my old friend Rachel. And as she was saying in my Home from Home, I think really the first big event, or the first ever event of any kind I did, was here at the Asia Society, as Rachel was saying, in 1981 with my first book on Japan. And I have been shamelessly raiding its gift shop and savoring its galleries for 40 years now. I can't believe how many people are here. I hope you're not here in the hopes of listening to Vijay Iyer, the great jazz pianist, or Siddhartha Mukherjee. He's next Monday. You may have come 1 week too early. But it's astonishing, and it's a tribute to the Asia Society and to James that so many of you are here. I have spent the last 16 years doing an absolutely crazy thing, which is to write 2 books on the same subject at the same time, for the same publisher, to come out in the same season, each one an absolute contradiction of the other. So anything you read in one of my recent books on Japan, I hope will be completely upended in the other. And that's in part because I think that you all know, if you feel very strongly about a person or a place or a subject, you're likely to have conflicting feelings about it. And what you think at 10 in the morning is often very different from what you think at 6 in the evening. We're only consistent with the places to which we're indifferent. But also, I think living in Japan has taught me how fleeting every feeling is, and how temporary every thought is, and how really I'm a different person or non-person from second to second, as changeable as the sky. In Kyoto, they often say every reverse has a reverse. So the thought in bringing out these 2 books almost at the same time was to keep reversing unendingly. The most recent of these books, which Rachel was mentioning, A Beginner's Guide to Japan, is almost a bombardment of tweets, or they've been called koans or haikus, one-liners essentially about everything from baseball to love hotels to temples to fashion victims in Japan. And so it addresses all the burning questions I'm sure you've been entertaining for many years, such as how does an evening with Meryl Streep perfectly explain Japan? Why is anime the ultimate expression of an animist society? Why do baseball games in Japan, if the score is level at the end of 12 innings, end in a tie? And why did the wartime emperor of Japan in 1975 say, well, if you look at my country before the war and after the war, they're pretty much the same? Yeah, describing what for most of us is one of the most tumultuous transformations of the 20th century. And so that book is almost about every way in which Japan is the opposite of what we know in the West. And it's a series of the kind of observations or sweeping judgments that might strike anyone if she got off a plane in Narita Airport outside Tokyo tomorrow night. Why in Japan, when you have an emergency, do you not dial 911 but 119? Why, when you get onto the plane, are the seats lettered CBA and KJH? And I've lived in Japan 32 years now, and I can genuinely say it seems more like a foreign planet the longer I've been there. At the same time, I've lived in my little neighborhood in suburban Nara for 27 years now with my Japanese wife and my entirely Japanese stepchildren. And of course, if you're part of a family and a neighborhood and a community, you see that at the human emotional level, it's essentially the same story as everywhere else, as New York or Toronto or London, even if it's playing out in a different script. And so every time I go to my neighborhood post office, the women around me are talking about waiting lists at nursing homes and how they feel really guilty if they move their mother into a nursing home and really frazzled if they don't. And how all of us are experiencing almost the human equivalent to climate change, where August is visiting in mid-February, and suddenly humans are living longer than we've ever lived before. But that means living for year after year after year after our minds and our memories have begun to come apart. And so if the beginner's guide is really almost a foreigner's take on Japan, this book, Autumn Light, is meant to be just a description of an everyday neighborhood in which the neighborhood presents itself to you almost unmediated. And you can probably recognize it, my hope is, as easily as you would recognize your sister, your mother, or your neighbor. And so, of course, my cunning commercial thought is that if any of you by chance hates one of these books, you'll love the other, and vice versa. One, I think, they're as different as Heart and Head. They're as different as Cain and Abel, and they're about the two of the many ways in which we can confront this country that for me is the most foreign, but also at a deeper level, the most familiar. So I'm really looking forward to talking to James, but before I do so, I was asked to read briefly from each of these. I've never read from the beginner's guide before, so this will be a happy debut. And as I say, because it's a rather relentless blizzard of one-liners, I try to give the reader a break every now and then by stopping and just offering a vignette of sorts, opening out onto larger horizons. So this is one of those. What do you think you'll miss most when you leave? A close friend from California asks me one bright autumn afternoon. We're sitting on a bench in the deer park at the heart of Nara, watching the holiday atmosphere of a warm November unfold. A chic couple, dressed in black from head to toe, is batting a shuttlecock back and forth. Children play far off amidst the trees. Above a pond, the rusting leaves on the misty slopes look like something out of an old Eastern watercolor. Usually, people say they'll miss the food, the hot springs, my friend goes on, perhaps to prompt me, or the freedom of being a foreigner, able to get away with almost anything. I'll miss the cleanliness of the air, I say. I don't just mean the spotless streets and the fact that everyone changes clothes every day and always looks so freshly pressed and laundered. I don't mean even the shine around things, which makes you feel as if you're seeing every last surface through freshly polished glass, framed by drawers and screens as in a lens. I just mean that people don't feel the need to smudge every moment with their signature. When it's hot, they don't say, "Oh, it's warm enough to roast a chipmunk in the streets," or, "Phew, it's hotter than a squirrel on a barbecue." They just say, "Hot, isn't it?" in exactly the same words and exactly the same tone, so that it might be the air itself speaking, or the day. It might be no one at all. Around us, the scene is not so different from what you might find in Hyde Park or the Jardin du Luxembourg. People everywhere stretch out and have fun in much the same way. But there's a stillness, a self-containment in every direction, so crowded and so quiet, I haven't felt even in Myanmar or Singapore. Every night, I tell my friend, when I leave the health club, 4 or 5 kids at the front desk shout out, "Take it easy, you've worked hard." I know it's just a formula. I know it means nothing at all, but it's an attempt to sweeten the moment, to give me energy, to make every departure feel like the first step towards coming back. It suggests that something remains steady in a world of constant change. My friend says nothing. That's one of the practices that he's trained me in ever since we met, my 3rd day in the country. Back home, when I tell friends that I always buy Toyotas because they're so uncomplicated and reliable, fewer features mean fewer things to go wrong, my friends don't always realize I'm speaking about relationships and conversations as much as about cars. When I talk of the economy of verbal and facial expressions in Japan, my friends may not see that stock verbal exchanges make the country go round much more than any Nikkei index does. We've been on the bench for more than an hour now. The sky is slowly darkening. The deer are still grazing in the failing light. Children are beginning to collect their things to follow their parents back home. Michael will soon be moving back to California after half a lifetime in Japan. I suppose it's all the things you don't have to say or explain, I conclude, that I'll miss when I'm not here. And we stand up and walk back to the station. So, as you can tell, thank you. That's very much entirely a foreigner's take on Japan. And this first book, Autumn Light, is, as I said, meant to be Japan seen from within. And they say around Kyoto that life is a joyful participation in a world of sorrows. A world of sorrows because every birth ends in a death, every meeting ends in a separation. But I think for my Japanese neighbors, it's precisely the fact that things don't last that moves them to find joy in right now. We can't take for granted what will happen tomorrow, and so we don't look past the opportunity for beauty and wonder this moment. So at one point in this book, which is an attempt to bring joy and sorrow into the same frame, to bring reality and possibility into the same sentence, I describe how the Dalai Lama comes to Japan every November, and every November my wife and I travel with him across Japan for every hour of his working days there. And so this is a moment when we visit the Dalai Lama in his hotel in Kyoto and remember a trip we took with him a little earlier. As we say hello to the Dalai Lama, I recall the November day 2 years ago when we traveled up with him to a fishing village north of Tokyo, laid waste by the tsunami of 8 months earlier. A few miles out of the city of Sendai, we began passing along clean, modern roads lined by nothing but compacted trash, block-long rectangles of smashed cars and refuse. Telephone poles listed at 45-degree angles. A solitary chair sat in the open skeleton of what had once been a living room. Buses bobbed on the water beside us. When we pulled up at Ishinomaki, hundreds had gathered along the road there to greet the famous visitor. It was to see nothing but a flattened landscape that looked like pictures I'd seen of Hiroshima after the bomb. More than 3,000 had lost their lives in this village alone, many of them children. 19,000 had lost their homes. The Dalai Lama stepped out of his car and strode without hesitation to the people, mostly women, who had assembled in the street to see him. Many were sobbing or calling out in limited English, "Thank you, thank you." He held one person's head against his chest. He blessed another. He touched heads, shook hands, looked into one set of eyes, then the next, asking, "What do you feel? Are you still sad?" "Please," he told them, as the women sobbed and others pushed forwards, "please, be brave. Please, change your hearts. You cannot change what has happened. Please help everyone else. Help others become okay." The crowd fell quiet. Some of its members nodded. "Too many people died," he went on. "If you worry, it can't help them. Please, work hard. That is the best offering you can make to the ones you lost. Rebuild your community as your country rebuilt itself after the war." It's the kind of advice that anyone might give, perhaps, but when he turned around to walk towards the temple that had survived, gravestones in the foreground tilted crazily over or knocked down entirely, I saw the Dalai Lama take off his glasses and wipe away a tear himself. Suffering is the central fact of life from his Buddhist viewpoint. It's what we do with it that defines our lives. Just one day later, we return with the Dalai Lama and his bodyguards to his hotel, hasten up in the elevator to the top floor, and walk at high speed down the corridor with him to his room. His eyes are often red after a long day of events, but his pace never slackens. He's holding Hiroko's hand as he moves forwards, As in some physical expression of his teachings, he reflexively reaches for any set of hands to grasp between his own as he strides along. Just before we arrive at his door, Hiroko says, "Your Holiness, we must leave you now, but thank you for everything." He's on his way to Tokyo next day. We have obligations at home. Also, she says, and her voice begins to falter just a little, "I want to tell you, my father passed away this year." Instantly, the fast-stepping monk stops. He looks at her directly. "When?" "This year." "What cause?" "No cause. He was old. His body was tired." He steps forwards and holds her for a long, long time. Then he steps back and looks searchingly at her. "Remember, only body gone. Spirit still there, only cover gone." Then he heads into his room and at the threshold turns around to wave at us briskly, "Good night, thank you," and then is gone as we head back into the golden flares of late afternoon. Thank you for listening, and I'm really glad to invite my old friend James Shaheen to engage us in conversation.
Well, thank you, Pico. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Listening to you read those two passages side by side, I realized in a way, it just occurred to me now, that the two books do in a way speak to each other. It seems to me that what is explicit in the Beginner's Guide is implicitly played out in Autumn Light. And one of the things that I heard when you read from a Beginner's Guide is what you'll miss, and that's the economy of speech and the value placed on individuality and personality in our own culture as opposed to its diminished role in Japan. Can you say something about that?
I can say too much, actually, about both of those, especially too much by Japanese standards, but you're absolutely right, because I think the first book, which begins with my father-in-law's death and is about how we make friends with impermanence, is really about this sense that absence can fill us up more than presence does. And you all know if you've had a breakup or if you've lost somebody from your life, that person consumes you, as the people in your room never can. And just as you perfectly said, I think a lot of the second book is about how silence is more eloquent than speech. And I don't know if I've said this to you before, but soon after I arrived in Japan, I realized that the perfect date in Japan consists of two people going to a movie, sitting in rapt attentiveness before it, and going home and never saying a word about the movie. Right. Because the Japanese are wise enough to know that words are what separate us, and speech is what brings us together. And as to go to your point about individuality, words are what separate us, but silence is what brings us together. I said it exactly wrong, being a Westerner. You can tell I live on a tourist visa in Japan. I'm not truly Japanese. Silence is what brings us together, and partly because silence is what dissolves our individuality. Silence is what brings us into a common space where you're not James and I'm not Pico, and we're just part of something much bigger than either of us. And I think you might know, because you've been kind enough to read each of these books 2 times, I spent, as I said, 16 years writing these very small books in honor of the Japanese principle of subtraction and taking out as much as possible so that the spaces between the lines and the words would speak more maybe than the words themselves. And I always think of that Japanese aesthetic, whereby many of you know if you go into a classical tatami room, there are only 2 things there, a vase and a scroll. And because there are only 2 things there, you bring all your attention to them and you find everything you could want and much more just in those 2 things. And it's interesting, when friends ask me why did I leave New York City to live in Japan, I sometimes say I was drawn there by the empty room, by the sense of having more hours in the day, more space in my head. I was working 4 blocks from Times Square when I was here, so I had almost an overload of stimulation. And going to Kyoto was a way to clear things out, so that in my head and in my physical space, I was in an empty room. But I was just thinking this afternoon, when we think of the empty room in this context, in this side of the world, it suggests loneliness and the need to fill it with a human presence. In Japan, somehow, I think the emptiness is more aesthetic than emotional. And probably many Japanese feel that they don't have enough space to be by themselves. But that's their conflicting problem.
Yeah, you said that what you learned to speak in the West and you learned to listen in Japan. Is that more or less what you're talking about, at least in part?
Yeah, now I'm speaking too much and not listening enough. But yes, I went there to learn to listen and to try to learn to be invisible and to learn to define myself by something other than my resume or my business card. And also, I suppose, to learn that the most important thing about me or you, anybody here, is actually what's not individual, what we have in common, which, of course, is the writer's essential knowledge or wisdom, which is that if I'm writing a book, I have to go deep inside myself. But it will only be an effective book if I find that place in Pico that James recognizes inside James, and others do. So if you're tunneling too deep into those parts of your own experience which are too much your own, you're locking yourself into a room, really.
Well, you said something very funny, or you quoted somebody. You said, if you're thinking about going to therapy, go to Japan instead. I think you were I think you were talking, quoting Joseph Campbell.
Exactly. Yeah. What a wise person. He's one of the wisest presences I've ever met. And exactly that, yes.
So I was thinking in Autumn Light, the individual and the individual's diminished agency becomes very apparent. And the protagonist of all things is the season of autumn itself.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes. This being the Asia Society, many of you here have probably been in Japan in late November, and you'll know that the skies are blazing blue, cloudless, warmer than Southern California into the early days of December, but underneath that blue are the golds and scarlets and lemon yellows of the turning leaves. I used to live in New York and I used to live in Boston, and I know that fall is a glorious season here, but there's something about the wistfulness of Japan and the way it plays off the buoyancy in the autumn that really speaks to what I see to be the heart of that culture. Again, this being the Asia Society, many of you know that in Japan there's one word used for the self that exists behind closed doors and a completely different word for the self that's out in public. And I think it's assumed there'd be no connection between the two. And I've always thought that the cherry blossom, which is pretty and frothy and giggly, a bit erotic, that's the face Japan likes to present to the larger world. But at its heart, it's that mingling of radiance and melancholy that is the autumn. And I think when I wrote the book Autumn Light, almost the title suggests that it's a homage to the great Japanese film director Yasujiro Ozu, who made Late Spring and Early Autumn Afternoon and Early Autumn and Tokyo Story, many great films, especially in the 1950s. And you remember, if you've seen his films, that quite often there'll be the sound of a festival playing in the street while somebody is sobbing next door. And I think Japan, more than any culture I know, has this sense that beauty and sadness are inextricable. And in fact, happiness and sadness are inextricable. Happiness has implicit a sadness in it, because we know that happiness can't last forever. And sadness has a depth that makes for a kind of fulfillment in Japan that fills them up and that we might describe as deep engagement in life.
Right, so you say that Japan is an autumn country, in other words.
I do.
That most clearly defines it for you.
Yes, especially because my other official home is California, which is the land of endless summer. And you know 100 times more than I do about Buddhism, but I felt when I go back and forth between California and Japan, my elderly mother lives in California, so I have to spend a lot of time there, that California, more than any part of America, is pledged to the pursuit of happiness. And I feel Japan is based on the Buddhist notion of the reality of suffering. And I think when I went to Japan, from New York City and from California, I was really going almost in the spirit of consulting a wise elder who's lived for 1,400 years with typhoon, forest fire, earthquake, warfare, and knows, as I said before, how to make its peace with suffering and loss. California and the US, when I was a little kid, gave me this great sense of possibility. But when I was in my late 20s, I thought now it's a time to complement it with a sense of reality, and I thought maybe one of those Buddhist countries would be the place to go to. Is that a fair assumption? You know a lot about Buddhism.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Since I am an editor of a Buddhist magazine, yes. I'll ask you about Impermanence, because there's this elegiac tone that runs through the book, yes. Autumn Light, and you say quite explicitly at one point that impermanence is more an accepted fact of life in Japan, by far more anyway than here.
I think so. Everyone everywhere knows about impermanence, but I think Japan has almost made impermanence its central creed and its religion. And that's why when friends visit from the West, when I'm in Japan, and they ask me about religion, I sometimes say I think the seasons are the real religion in Japan. And of course that's a religion without texts, without dogmas, without exclusions, but a constant training in changelessness and change. Every year the autumn looks much the same, but every year those of us looking at it are 1 year older, 1 year closer or deeper within the autumn of our lives, 1 year closer to the end. And the way in which, as I said in that reading actually, changelessness is what we hang on to in a world of constant change. Mm-hmm. So I mention in the book how in the Tale of Genji, the central work of fiction in Japan, the word for impermanence comes up more than 1,000 times. When you're walking around Kyoto, there's a bell, literally, that's tolling, and it's saying, this day could be your last. You walk towards a temple in the eastern hills of Kyoto, and there's a big sign which they thoughtfully translate into English that literally says something like, today you're laughing, tomorrow you could be bones. And I think my Japanese neighbors live with a very keen sense of that. And of course the natural elements confirm that for them. And as I said up at the podium, I think that's why they're so good at enjoying life. To me, the people I know in Japan have an unusual gift of appreciation. And the quality of certainly public life there is not melancholy. It's very much about accentuating the positive. And it's certainly about living with what you can't change. And maybe they have a much larger sense of what they can't change, we can't change, than we do in the US. America's gift to the world is the sense of opportunity. But sometimes the American challenge is thinking it can change everything and being unpleasantly surprised when they find that nature or other forces have a mind of their own. And I think everybody here, after the tsunami, for example, in 2011, was struck at how there were very few complaints heard in Japan. They took it stoically, as they seem to take everything stoically. They just stood patiently in line, waiting to see if their lives could be rebuilt. And I think part of that stoicism comes from just what you were saying, which is not being wed to an individual destiny. So people wouldn't complain there because they know every neighbor has gone through as much or more. So what's the virtue of a complaint? And a complaint is just foisting a burden on a neighbor who's probably overburdened already.
Right, you make a very clear distinction between, in Autumn Light, between unhappiness and loss. So yes. Loss is one thing, and happiness quite another.
Yes, and I think I actually learnt that maybe from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, who I think is always telling us that suffering and unhappiness are not the same thing, which is a variation on what you said. That suffering, I think, am I fair in saying, for Buddhists is the first noble truth, but the next noble truths are how we come to terms with it, and that unhappiness is just the position we can bring to it or not bring to it as we see fit. I never forget when I wrote my book about the Dalai Lama, one of the things that most humbled and startled me was to learn that when he concluded his flight into exile in 1959, 14 or 16 days over the highest mountains on earth, and he finally arrived at the Indian border, he turned to his younger brother, who was accompanying him, as you know, on that trip, and he said, "Now we are free." So instead of seeing this as loss, he was already seeing it as opportunity. We, looking at the Dalai Lama forced into exile, would think he's lost his country, he's lost his home, he's lost the role he was born to execute as ruler of Tibet. What a tragedy. He instantly realized that outside Tibet, he could actually reform the system and bring in many much-needed improvements that maybe he never could have done within the feudalism and the centuries of tradition that encircled him in Lhasa. And so it's a small example of how he would tell us that almost at any moment, to some extent, not entirely, but maybe more than we suppose, we have the chance to change the world by changing how we look at it. So, for example, I lost my house and everything I own in a forest fire many years ago, and I think 500 houses were lost in that fire. And I noticed in the wake of the fire that some people probably were traumatized for life, sad to say. Other people, after a period of adjustment, thought, actually, this frees me to do many things I could never have done before, to live more lightly on the earth, to move to the other place that I've always wanted to be, to notice that actually I didn't need 90% of the clutter that I had in my home, and that really everything you can replace after such a loss is the least important stuff: books, clothes, furniture. And everything that's most important is what you can't replace: notes, photographs, keepsakes. And so I think the Stoics had the same awareness and wisdom that the events of our lives are much less important than what we do with them, which I think is probably a central Buddhist precept, is it?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that losing all those things opens up a space, and that opens up possibility.
Yes.
I think.
In fact, I mean, I've always thought the one blessing of being a writer is that whatever happens to you, you can turn it into material. So I was caught in the middle of that fire for 3 hours, which made it much easier to lose everything, because I came so close to losing my life. But as soon as a fire truck found me and I was able to drive down to the town, the first thing I did was go to a computer and write an account of the fire. And the account I wrote, 2 hours after being in the middle of the fire, ended with a classic Japanese poem by Masahiro: "My house burnt down, now I can see better the rising moon."
Right.
And that speaks to just what you were saying, I think.
Yeah. Making Autumn itself, or Japan, the protagonist, is interesting because you talk about Ozu, you talk about Japanese painters, and how the background becomes foreground. In other words, the conditions that shape us are more prominent or important, really, than how these individuals act out their fate. Maybe it's the relationship to those conditions that is the focus, rather than this rather individualistic or willful attempt to change conditions.
That's beautifully said. I love what you just said. And yes, it's exactly how I felt. And again, it sort of plays to this fake dialectic I've created between younger societies and older. Because certainly when I was young, I very much thought, I can make my life. I've got all these plans, I've got this agenda, and I can create my life according to it. And at this point in my life, I notice that everything that's happened to me, good or bad, has come out of the blue, and has had very little to do with my intention. And that other forces, whatever they are, have been making my life probably with a much greater wisdom than I ever could. And I think that is what I see at the heart of Japanese thinking. Of course, everybody wants to find the love of their life, wants to find happiness, wants their children to grow up healthy, all of that. But I think they, as you suggest, have a much larger sense of, for example, all the natural forces. Hence, they're bowing before the seasons that play havoc with our lives or remake our lives. And that's why I'm always struck. I think some of the first Japanese paintings I ever saw were in this building. And what struck me was when I look at Hiroshige, I'm not noticing the individual figures. I'm noticing the falling snow, or I'm noticing Fuji in the background, or I'm noticing the blue of the ocean. If you read an Ishiguro novel, and I think that's why Kazuo Ishiguro, who's lived in England since the age of 5, is still such a deeply Japanese figure. At some level, he goes very deeply into complicated emotions. But beyond that, the human beings are small figures against, as you said, this huge landscape. And of course, there have been surveys conducted whereby they'll show a painting to a group of kids from Canada and a group of kids from East Asia. And the Canadians, like Americans, probably see what's in the foreground, and the kids from Korea or China or Japan see what's in the background, which is a way of saying they want to be in the background too. And I think, again, growing up as a teenager in California, we were always being told, you've got to be yourself. And I thought, well, I actually went to Japan to be not myself, to try to understand other people, which is exactly what the writer's job is, to try to get into somebody radically different from yourself.
You know, in the beginner's guide, there are all sort of koanic statements and like things that Rachel read, the arrows, the question mark in the middle of the mystery. And in Autumn Light, there's this sometimes, it's run through with impermanence and loss and the weight of conditions. And yet, at the same time, there's ping pong. You play a lot of ping pong.
Thank you. Yes. Partly because it's a book about beginning with the death and about getting older. I wanted to make sure that there was a counterpoint. So every day I play ping pong with my mostly elderly neighbors in Japan. I'm a sort of teen idol figure because most of them are in their 70s and 80s. I'm almost the tallest in the whole club. I'm 5'7.5". And I'm the youngest by far. But one of the things, if my wife were here, she could reproduce it perfectly. A lot of my neighbors, 83 years old, 84 years old, they look pretty unsteady. But get them behind a ping pong table, I mean, they learned before the war, and one thing that's interesting is half of them use the Chinese style of holding the paddle, and the other half use the Western style, so it's a perfect emblem of Japan caught between these two powers. But one of the things I love is every now and then a teenager will show up in the club, and one of my 83-year-old friends will completely thrash him, which reminds you that autumn has strengths that spring might envy, and that life doesn't go in a straight line, and that we get stronger in certain ways as the years go on, and weaker in others. And I have a complimentary passage, as you remember, in the book, in which at one point a young writer from Los Angeles came to Japan for the first time. So his first day in the country, he asked me if I could get together for tea. So I met him, and he had a notebook, and he started reading out sentences about Japan. And I was very taken aback. These seemed quite illuminating. And I said, my goodness, I would never see that in a month of Sundays. And he looked at me strangely, and he kept on reading. And I thought, gosh, I wish I had that kind of insight. These are extraordinary observations. Where did you get them from? And he pointed out that he got them all from the book I wrote at my first year in Japan, which reminded me I knew more when I was 29 than I did 30 years later. And that's also a good thing to be reminded, that actually fresh eyes see much more than familiar eyes often.
Right. For many of them, retiring was a new spring, really.
Yes, and I think for me that was part of the beauty of the Pingpong Club, because I think it's relatively easy for foreigners to make contact with women in Japan, because sadly women still relegated to the margins of public life and really second-class citizens. Japan's very backward, I would say, in its treatment of women. So women have everything to gain by making friends with foreigners, and even in some cases marrying unpromising foreigners like myself. But I'd never really met Japanese men. Japanese men were just those guys in three-piece suits yawning at 6 a.m. as they're waiting to take the bus to their office and barking at convenience store clerks. And as I saw it, turning their backs on their wives and children to support them only financially. But just as you say, in the Pingpong Club, suddenly they were in springtime. Again, they were released at last in their 70s from all their responsibilities. They were as charming as little boys. They'd dance around when they won a point. And they were allowed to be humans again. And they were as engaged as grandfathers as they'd been seemingly disengaged as fathers. And so I think a lot of the book is about how, on a day like today in New York City, in Japan it would be called a second spring day, or a baby spring day, and that autumn has spring inside it. Spring doesn't have so much of autumn. I think that's the advantage that autumn has over spring, that it has the memories of spring and summer, and actually, therefore, too, can appreciate a day like today even more, because it knows what's past and it knows what's to come.
You know, I have to say, when I was really taken with the Ping Pong Club and the teams, and I have to admit that I kept thinking, is somebody going to win? I mean, is there somebody going to be the star, the great Ping Pong award or something? And in fact, competition plays a very different role, if any. So do you want to say something about that? I found that very interesting, that baseball could end in a tie. I mean, my response was how unsatisfying, you know?
Yes.
But I guess the virtue is harmony. You say something about that.
Exactly. I mean, it reminds me of what Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, I think, which is you give your all to every moment, but you don't try to win. That people are keeping track of the points in every game, but they're not keeping track of who's winning the games, which means everybody leaves after an hour and a half of furious excitement playing ping pong in an equal state of delight. I couldn't tell you at the end of any day, have I won more games than I've lost. All I could tell you is I've had a really good time. And it's interesting, again, as you were saying, we play best of 2 sets, which usually means there's no winner or loser. If somebody does happen to lose, we change partners every 6 minutes by lot. So if you did lose, you're likely to win again, 6 minutes on with a new partner. Yes, and I think I have in the book, and you and I may have spoken about it before, this example about when one of the first times an American manager came to Japan to lead a professional team, Bobby Valentine, actually, from the Mets in 1995. He took this really mediocre squad. He led them to a stunning second-place finish, and he was instantly fired. And many foreigners were taken aback, so they went to the team, what's with this? And back came the answer from the team spokesman, oh, he was fired because of his emphasis on winning. And it was a tonic reminder, as James was saying, here we think winning is a good thing. Right. There maybe not, because that creates losers, and that creates inequity and rifts within the society. And to me, Japan really functions like a symphony orchestra. And in a symphony orchestra or a choir, there are no winners or losers. They're all working together to create a harmony, which is why foreigners are quite threatening to Japan and in Japan.
Right. The notion of identity is very different, and that seems to be part of it. When you were speaking at the beginning of the evening, you talked about changing, that feelings are so fleeting, or what we think this morning we may not think this evening. And you talk about in Autumn Light how they may change clothes 5 times a day.
Yes.
What they are in the morning may not be what they are in the evening, and we may think, well, there's a lack of continuity there. But what they're saying really is that there isn't that continuity.
There isn't that continuity.
There is not that continuity.
No. Though I also sometimes think they change constantly on the surface in every way so as not to change deep down. Right. The famous example everyone cites is that the most celebrated sacred Shinto shrine in the land, in Ise, many of you know, is rebuilt every 20 years. So it'll always be in the same state of dilapidation and freshness. I mean, just imagine if we did that to Notre Dame or the Vatican or whatever. Unthinkable from our way of thinking. But there, it's another kind of riddle about changelessness and change, like the Emperor's statement about nothing really changing during the war. It's interesting, that notion about individuality. I think maybe 19 years ago, I wrote a piece for your magazine about it in relation to the Buddha from Brooklyn, and how when teachers from the East come and instruct us in what to do with the self and the non-self, it's hard for there not to be something significant lost in translation, just because the idea of the self that they're working with is probably very different from... Right. I'm guessing if one of my Japanese neighbors were here and you asked, what is your self, he'd show you the card representing his company, or tell you which neighborhood he lived in, or which family he'd been part of. You or I might not do that. And so the self is that much harder for us to dissolve, probably.
You have a long relationship with the Dalai Lama. I think you see him every year, is that right? Or
yes,
every few years?
At least.
Right.
Yes.
And you made an observation that I found very interesting. You said, when the Dalai Lama is here and he talks about ritual, nobody really pays attention. But if he talks about meditation, everyone listens with rapt attention. Whereas in Japan, it's the reverse. He talks about meditation, they're not particularly interested. When he talks about ritual, they're taken with that. How do you see that?
So I must say, I can't take credit for that observation. That was the Dalai Lama himself who noticed that when he was in Japan. And yes, again, you know more about this than I do, but my sense is that, well, Buddhism doesn't have much in the way of texts in Japan. It mostly is a set of rituals. Shinto, of course, has no texts whatsoever. And that goes back to the point about silence. That's why it can bring everyone together. There are no doctrines for scholars to argue about the way they might with the Bible or the Talmud or whatever. And I think for the Dalai Lama, coming from a very analytical, rigorous, philosophical kind of Buddhism, it can almost be a frustration that they're not wrestling with the ideas and texts as his community would. But the Japanese have made an art of saying nothing and not complicating the head, and seeing that the head can make a mountain out of a molehill, whereas our lives is often making a molehill out of a mountain, really. I mean, our lives are simpler than our ideas about it. And to go back to what you were saying a minute ago about continuity, there's that wonderful line I think I've written for you also about Leonard Cohen, who, of course, was an ordained Zen monk for 5.5 years. And he had that great line, I don't care about my inner feelings come and go. I don't trust inner feelings come and go. Which again is almost a heretical thing to us. Our inner feelings come and go and we don't take them seriously. He didn't as a result of his, 40 years of training with a Zen teacher. But it's another example of how great perhaps the divide is by the way we deal with things, and sometimes they do over there.
Yeah, I would think that a very highly ritualized life would keep a rather clear mind. You talk about the seasons in Japan being separated into 70 or so.
Yes, that's right.
And that looking at the autumn leaves itself is a ritual.
Yes. Well, I love what you just said, and I hadn't thought of it that way, that ritual does clear the mind. And I think what you did just now was define Zen practice, which is almost entirely ritual. And that's freeing you from the needless thoughts with which we disable ourselves. And so, absolutely so, most of my neighbors get up in their Sunday best, flock out into the temple gardens every late November to look at the same trees they see every year. And I suppose it's the way we might go and see the rose windows at Chartres, or I love St. Patrick's Cathedral here. I could see them again and again and again. And the reason I like looking at those windows or looking at the maple leaves is, again, it puts me in place. It reminds me of everything that's much larger than I am, that's probably going to affect my life much more than I could.
You know, when I was preparing for our podcast several months ago, I read Autumn Light, and then I got an email from you saying, oh, by the way, there's another book. And
Yes.
your publisher was rather unhappy that they would be published so closely together, so they moved them apart a bit. But they really are kind of companions, aren't they, those two books?
Like brother and
sister.
sister.
I had to read an extra book before I talked to you.
Yes. Yes, and I must say,
I liked it.
My publisher was very wise, because my idea was to bring them out on the same day. And they thought, well, they'll
Publishers don't
cannibalize
like
each
that.
other. Yeah, you're a publisher, you know that wouldn't be wise. So they put a few weeks between them. But as I say, my hope is that they speak for different parts of ourselves. Because I feel that whenever we're choosing a partner or a job or a place to live in, what we're really looking for is that blend of the foreign and the familiar. We need the foreign to keep ourselves stimulated, look around the next corner. We need novel to be engaged, but we need the familiar to ground us and make us feel settled and calm. Again, it's changelessness and change in a way. And so I wanted to write one book about why Japan feels mysteriously familiar to me and is familiar on an emotional level to everybody in this room. At the same time as I wanted to express the many fascinating ways that it's always foreign. And I think that's why I would wish I could spend every hour of my life in Japan, because I never sustained the illusion that I could get to the bottom of it, or I'm on top of things there. I spent my first 21 years in England, and unfortunately a part of me feels I can read England. I have a sense of what England is, which means I can't write about it and I can't be surprised. My eyes have closed to it. I've terminated my conversation with it, even though it's no doubt got many things with which to surprise me. Whereas with Japan, every time I go to the grocery store, I'm reminded I don't have a clue, which is wonderful for a writer, because it means there's always the prospect of learning something new and then being surprised yet again.
You know, for all of the focus on autumn and the conditions that shape our lives, it's also a story of personal loss. I mean, it starts with your father-in-law, his death. Your mother-in-law goes to home. We learn that your brother-in-law is someone whom you've never met, that he's had a rift with family. He's a Jungian psychologist, I think. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah, and
yes.
Odd in Japan, right? Maybe he should come to the West. But you talk about this family and its splinters a bit.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that? I found that very moving. I mean, what's actually going on in the family, and also with the Pingpong Club. People disappear and we learn that they've passed away.
Yes.
And they get a new partner. They just get a new ping pong player. But there's this acceptance on the one hand, and yet there's this great sadness too.
Yes, I love that, the mix of acceptance and real feeling. And I think what you were describing in the family is exactly right, and that's the universal. Every family is broken, and every family in the world is about broken hearts, in part. And how do you live with the broken hearts and the rifts that will be there between parent and child or between siblings? And what you said in passing about my brother-in-law moving to the West actually really puts its finger on the whole book, essentially, and that whole story. Because when I moved to Japan in the late 1980s, there were 4 registered psychoanalysts in all Greater Tokyo, population 15 million. Psychoanalysis, that Jungian or Freudian psychology, isn't something traditionally they've done in Japan. And my brother-in-law, I've known my wife 32 years, but as James has just said, I've never met my brother-in-law. He, at a very early age, surveying the post-war landscape in Japan, as his father was pushing him towards economics, said, no, I think there are going to be a lot of confused minds in our society. I need to study psychology. So he did that in Japan, but then he did come to this country to get his master's in Kansas, and then he went to Switzerland and got his doctorate at the Jung Institute. And then he came back to Japan, and he did what I think any therapist recommends all of us to do, which is write a 25-page letter to the parents about everything they've done wrong, and to the sister. But he also did what every therapist says you shouldn't do, which is send it to the parents. Since I've never met him, I'm not in a position to know why he cut off the entire family, parents and sister, 30 years ago. But a part of me wonders whether bringing Jungian psychology into a rather traditional Buddhist society doesn't again make for something that's getting mistranslated. The Buddha famously said, if you have an arrow sticking out of your flesh, don't question where the arrow came from or what kind of arrow it is, just pull it out. Very pragmatic, just like the Dalai Lama, who I see as essentially a doctor traveling the world and offering prescriptions. Jung would say, think about where that arrow came from and go to the source. And I think I may be misrepresenting it, but one way or another, I'm realizing one of the hidden currents in the book is I was traveling to Japan to learn all the things I thought that Japan could teach me I couldn't so easily find in California. And at the very same time, my unmet brother-in-law was coming here, just as you say, to learn the things that we can teach Japan. So yes, the whole book is centered around a family because families have no address. They belong everywhere. And so the thought was to sort of demystify Japan and say that if any of you go there tomorrow, you'll be endlessly fascinated by the foreign surfaces. But what will really reach you is the kindness and probably the familiarity of the people, which is not something that's foreign at all.
Mm-hmm. I may have asked you this before, I don't remember, but perhaps in the podcast. You have parents who are Indian. You grew up in Oxford and in California. You're a Westerner, and yet you've lived, or visited at least, most everywhere. And you spend 7 months a year in Japan. And you move easily in both cultures, despite the distance sometimes you feel in Japan. And we're living at a time where that cosmopolitanism or that globalism is under threat. I mean, rising nationalism and really around the world is challenging that whole notion.
So true.
Of this sort of cosmopolitan or globalized life. Do you feel up against that at all, or how do you see that?
A part of me thinks, or maybe hopes, nationalism is on the rise because it's on the run. And people clearly are feeling very threatened by those of us crossing borders, willingly or unwillingly. The main division in the world is between the city and the countryside. I was just thinking yesterday, as you said, I'm familiar with North Korea and Iran and Easter Island. I've never been to Mississippi. I've never been to South Dakota. So those people in, let's say, rural America who feel that urban people like me are ignorant of them and belong to another planet are right. They're justified. And same thing in my native England. The gap between London and the rest of the country is a gap between centuries, and a gap between London has much more in common with Shanghai and Tokyo than it may with rural Suffolk or Yorkshire, or wherever it might be. So it's a very significant problem, but I think the reason the nationalists are whipping up this fervor is they realize at an individual level, incrementally, day by day, black and white are disappearing, dissolving. Every time somebody in this room or in this city befriends or especially falls in love with somebody from another culture, which happens a million times a day, the child who emerges out of that union is going to make a mockery of East-West or black-white divisions. I read in the New York Times a few years ago, this is startling, that in 1958, 3% of Americans approved of mixed-race marriages. By 2014, it was 87% approved. 3% to 87% in my lifetime. I never, 20 years ago, would imagine that I would see a half Kenyan, half Kansan man who grew up in Indonesia, ostensibly the most powerful person in the world. If we look at the world of writing, Zadie Smith, Malcolm Gladwell, they're all themselves in their beings exploding the distinctions between black and white. I was in San Francisco a few years ago, and I was talking to a woman, and she said, well, maybe I don't think so fondly about Islam. And lo and behold, my daughter marries someone from Iran. My granddaughter is Islamic. How can I hate my granddaughter? And I think at that level, person by person, we're moving forward so quickly that these larger tribal groups want to pull us back into the past because they're scared of that future. But that future, I think, is unavoidable.
Right. I mean, the pace of change is so rapid that maybe
Yes.
that's jarring.
Yes.
You talk about how London has changed from the time you were a boy
Yes.
until now. So-
Yes. And I think, to me, the more serious problem is a gap between the relatively privileged cosmopolitans, like myself and probably many in this room, and the vast number of refugees who are being forced out of their homes by necessity, never wanted to leave their homes, have to face these same questions about where do I belong and what is my home, but in a much more undefended and anguished way than the likes of me would ever have to do. And so somebody like me, too much is seeing the world at 37,000 feet, and where borders do dissolve. But those people are crossing borders, and the borders within them and outside them are very sharp and pronounced, and that's what people like me need to be thinking about, I suspect.
Right. How did your children sort of adjust to this moving back and forth, or did they? Were they...
They didn't move back. So both my stepchildren are entirely Japanese. And suddenly their mother foisted on them this strange-looking dog who was at the dinner table every evening, who was me, who couldn't speak much Japanese. And they, being Japanese, were incredibly patient and kind with me. Our relations were made quite a bit easier when they were growing up, because really they spoke very limited English and I spoke very limited Japanese. But it goes back to something I was saying earlier about Japan, about the serious rift I feel there, which is, as soon as my son graduated from university, he joined Japan Airlines, he got a very nice job in Tokyo, he married, he's got a daughter, and he's leading a perfect Japanese life. The day my daughter graduated, she fled Japan, moved to Spain, lived there for 8 years, came back wonderfully from Spain with fluent English, as well as Spanish. So now I actually do have a family member with whom I can communicate very clearly.
Finally.
A big blessing, for them at least. But again, the woman has everything to gain by leaving Japan, and the man everything to lose by leaving. I think the other aspect of your question there has to do with my wife. And of course, when I went to Japan seeking to learn discipline and clarity and rootedness there, my third week in the country, I met my wife, who was as drawn to the California that I represented, that spoke for freedom, the chance to do things she could never do in Japan, and the possibility of making her own destiny, which wasn't really something that she was given as a woman in Japan. But more than my precipitating a change in her, she had an American friend who was living in Japan as a single mom, undergoing full Zen practice and working full-time. And my wife, who was married to a Japanese man when I met her, thought, wait a minute, if an American woman can go to a foreign country, support her 2 kids alone, and learn about the traditions, why can't I, as a Japanese woman? I have as much spirit and energy and determination as she. And so she did what was very radical in 1988, which is walk out of her marriage with her 2 kids and say to herself, I'm going to be sufficiently Western to make my own future, and not to accept the terms that have been given me. Now, many years on, it's almost startling how many of her younger female friends are divorced. And that's one of those things that, on the one hand, most of my Japanese neighbors would say, we're becoming too American, we're losing our soul and our identity to the West, and these are some of the things that are exploding the nuclear family and tearing at this order that we've created over 1,400 years. Other people might say, well, finally, Japan is realizing that it can't suppress its women, and that in a global order, even Japan has to be attentive to the global norms, one of which is equal opportunities for men and women. So people would debate how much it's losing and how much it's gaining, but certainly the Japanese women are gaining, though at the cost of losing their marriages.
I hope I got this right. A Zen priest introduced you to your wife, is that right?
Yes, yes, that's right. Essentially, we met at his wedding, at his initiation ceremony of some kind, and he always delighted in calling himself our Cupid. He was very glad that we met there rather than the discotheque or bar.
So the book is also about aging. I had knee surgery this year, so I think about it now.
Ouch, yeah.
It seems that aging in Japan isn't quite so dire as it seems to be here. Is that true?
Maybe.
Aside from dealing with it, the physicality of it, it seems that there's more of a place or a path.
a path. That's a perfect way of putting it. Yes, and that age has traditionally been revered in East Asia as in most traditional societies. I mean, when I first arrived in Japan, I was taken aback to be told that the polite question to ask somebody as soon as you meet her is, how old are you? Because then you know how deeply to bow, where you stand in relation to her. You know, if a young-looking woman says she's 73, actually you look on her with much more respect, which, believe me, is not the case in California. But
I grew up in California. So
that's right, sorry.
I'm suffering greatly.
Sorry to be using it as a straw dog in this argument. But yes, indeed, in that sense. Though again, I think my Japanese friends would worry that the social fabric is fraying there. And one phenomenon I touch on in my book, but which has got a lot of play here recently, is how elderly couples in Japan often don't have anymore a daughter to look after them in their old age because she's moved to New York City or California, perhaps, or because she wants an American destiny even while remaining in Japan and is less committed to filial responsibility. And so, famously, they will literally go and hire an actress to come and knock on their door every Sunday and say, "Hi, Mom, hi, Dad, I've really missed you, let's have a wonderful Sunday afternoon together," which to us is strange. But to the Japanese is a very practical way of dealing with a hole in the heart and a real problem.
Right. Where you live and what you describe in the book, though, in many ways seems so traditionally Japanese. I mean, is that because it's a suburb and removed from the city?
So traditionally?
Yeah, it seems very, I mean, it seems that in many ways the way they're living is the way they've lived for a very, very long time. The way it's described.
Well, I'm so glad you say that. And of course, that's my prejudice speaking. My Japanese friends may say something different, but exactly so. And I think one of the themes of the Autumn Light book is that the suburb where I live is built in the 1970s to look like Long Island. It's entirely Western. Nearly all the buildings Western style. All the streets are straight. Not a single shrine or temple in the entire neighborhood. And even the two main drags are literally called School Dory and Park Dory, using the English language terms to convince my mostly elderly retired neighbors that they've attained their dream of living in a Japanese version of California. So it couldn't look less traditional. But just as James was saying, it's on the edge of the city of Nara, which was the capital in the year 710. And Nara, though more populous than Cincinnati or Pittsburgh, has right at its heart the biggest municipal park in all of the country. And those of you who've been there will know that central Nara is nothing but temples and shrines and pagodas and reflecting ponds and sutra houses, and most visibly 1,200 wild deer who roam around untamed, literally ruling the place. If you go to the City Hall building, 5-story glass and concrete building, you'll find stags seated on the front steps. And those deer speak for just the traditions that James was mentioning, because they're there because in the year 763 a deity was believed to have been seen coming over the western hills on a white deer. So they speak for that Shinto notion that everything has a soul. Kami-sama. You see this in the movies of Miyazaki, if you've seen Spirited Away or Princess Mononoke. This has a soul, that has a soul, this napkin has a soul in Japan. But they also, of course, remind everyone that the Buddha delivered his first sermon in the deer park in Sarnath. So my sense is very much that the surfaces of Japan couldn't be more modern, more Western, and more zany, and the depths are entirely traditional and deep and filled with spirits and startlingly changeless, which has been a big problem for Japan geopolitically, because I think it literally doesn't speak the language of the rest of the world. Metaphorically, it doesn't speak the language of the rest of the world either. But culturally, it's kept it an island. It's maintained its uniqueness, and it therefore remains an ever more powerful magnet for visitors from around the world who want to see this place that isn't part of global suburbia and doesn't look like anywhere else.
You know, when I listen to you talk and I consider both books, they're full of insights about Japan. It seems that you're intimately familiar with Japan, and yet you continue to say that the longer you're there, the less you understand, or the less, the more distance there is. How is that?
Well, the book I wrote 31 years ago may have more observations than these two put together, actually. The first book I presented, actually, at the Asia Society. But also, I think the longer I've been there, the more I've seen how fruitless opinions and thoughts are. It's just like flashes of sun on the ocean. It's not changing the ocean. Sorry?
They're fun, though.
They are fun, exactly. Well, I think treated as fun. They're endlessly fun. Yeah. And that's why I end my preface to the beginner's guide by saying, this is a book not to be taken too seriously. So I follow pro sports passionately because one has very strong opinions and responses to it, but that they don't mean very much, or that these aren't important things. And I think that's exactly how most of our opinions are. We can hold them passionately, but we shouldn't be attached to them because they're the clouds that happen to be passing right now.
I should have told that to our web editor. He took it with him to Japan like a guide. He said it was great. Okay, I think we're ready for questions from the audience, and Rachel will pick you out.
Pico, it's Jimmy. You're so witty and insightful and such a wordsmith. I wonder what in your childhood and youth did you do so well to have made you what you are? Was it voracious reading, keen observation, ferocious writing? Or was it nature or nurture?
Well, I mean, very, very generous comments, and I wouldn't really want to take credit for any of the qualities you kindly ascribed to me. I was very lucky. My parents were both professors. They grew up in British India, which meant, among other things, they can recite the Bible backwards and forwards. They're Hindu theosophists. They know more about Shakespeare and 19th century English poetry than I ever would, although I grew up in England. And they also had the generosity, although we were living in California, to allow me to go to school in England, where I probably got a classical education. I mean, I often complain that for 8 formative or deformative years of my life, from the age of 17 to 25, I only studied literature. So the nice thing about that is I was steeped in Christopher Marlowe and Chaucer and Keats and everything else. The not so good thing about it is I didn't do a single hour of social studies, science, languages, history, anything except literature. So I had a very narrow but intense education. I think maybe Melville said the whaling ship was his Harvard and his Yale, and Emerson said everything good is learnt on the highway, something like that. And I think because I grew up traveling a lot between places, I quickly saw the beauty of being confronted with what you don't understand and living calmly in the fact of not understanding it, not trying to get to the bottom of it, but enjoying the fact that, as for me in Japan, it's confounding. And so in that sense, I always got the sense that the world was much larger than my ideas of it, and that from the time I was 17 or 18, I was traveling a lot to many countries which I couldn't begin to explain away. So that was always a useful exercise, and also reminding me how provincial I am. I would think, this is reality, this is human life, and then I'll go to North Korea. Nothing I say about reality begins to apply there, or to many of the other places I've been. I do love reading, and as I was saying to James, when I moved from New York City to Japan, one of the reasons was so that every day would last 1,000 hours. And so every day in Japan, I'll finally be back there at the end of next week, I make a cup of very strong tea, and I get some mikan, which is tiny, very sweet Japanese tangerines. And I'll go out into our 30-inch terrace and sit in the sun, and I'll have this amazing conversation with Edith Wharton or Proust or Zadie Smith or Philip Roth or whoever it is. In other words, I'll just read for an hour, either a novel or a piece of serious nonfiction. And when I come back into the room after an hour of reading, I can feel myself, a better version of myself, deeper, more attentive, more nuanced, more intimate. And I find actually when I'm in this country and there's such a torrent of distractions, I often don't have enough time to read. And it's almost as if I'm shrinking. I'm becoming a fax version of myself. I'm losing one dimension. So I am a great believer in reading as the richest form of conversation, and also in trying to make as much open space in one's day as possible because that's where creation comes, and that's where fulfillment comes. I was thinking just maybe yesterday how we have so many open moments in the day, and we have a choice, again, like the Dalai Lama when he came into exile. Will we fill them up by checking our text, checking our emails, or turning on CNN? Or will we fill them up by doing nothing at all and coming up with some radical, beautiful new idea, which we can only do if we, in the margins of our lives, as it were. So again, the problem is never technology, but our imperfect use of technology. And James was surprised and maybe teasing me backstage as we were coming on. I've never used a cell phone, for example, because I rather feel I've got too much data and distraction in my life already, more than I know what to do with and more than I know how to make sense of. So any way in which I can limit that and give myself a little more time to process what's coming in on me, I'm grateful for. It's more an evasion of your question than an answer, but thank you for such a generous question.
I was about to say something about the cell phone.
Yeah.
I was so amazed.
You were surprised.
I was very
Well,
surprised.
you're an editor. You can't afford to. I found out after a few years in Japan that my nickname in the neighborhood among the kids was Isoro, which means parasite. I'm the only guy in the neighborhood who doesn't, put on a suit every morning and go off to the office as somebody like James does. Worse still, I send my wife to the office and I'm slouching around in my pajamas at noon. So, that gives me a lot of time to do things. I see two hands up there and one over there. We're leaning towards this side of the room, I think. Oh.
Thank you very much for the wonderful reading and conversation. My question is, could you say a little more about the style of communication in Japan and how it's affected you? So, for example, how people don't want to say no often directly to you,
yes.
right? Or statements end in this like ... kind of way.
Yes.
And do you feel that when you're in Japan that you are different and your way of communicating is different? Or has 32 years there made you different no matter where you are in how you communicate with people because of the influence of that indirectness? I wonder if you could say a little more about that.
Such a lovely question. Thank you. I certainly aspire to learn from Japan. I don't speak much in Japan, partly because my Japanese is so limited, but also because I see the virtue of leaving those empty spaces. Just as you say, I think in 30 years in Japan, I've almost never heard somebody say no. Those of you who've been there know that if you go to a sushi bar in Japan and you ask for a steak, they'll say, chotto, which means it's a little. It means it's a little impossible, you're a little crazy, and that's a little beside the point. But they'll never say no. And most sentences end in ne, so that the meaning isn't it, or right, so that the answer is yes, 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 exactly. So it's all about affirmation and drawing people together. And growing up in England, we had a little bit of that, but Japan much more so. I really like it, and in the part that I was reading about how everybody says it's hot, isn't it, in the same way, it's again a way of not smudging and disrupting the social fabric with your own individuality. So when it's hot, they all say, atsui ne, atsui ne, atsui ne, to the point where if I'm walking down the street and I hear a woman say that, I sometimes don't even know if it's my wife or a stranger, because everyone is saying it in exactly the same cadence with almost the same voice. And I think many a Japanese person would feel the confinement of that. But for me, as a foreigner who's grown up at the other extreme, I see the grace of it. I think one of the main ways in which Japan has changed me is to confer a sense of responsibility. When I walk down the street in Japan, I reflexively pick up every piece of trash I see. I didn't do that when I lived in New York City. And it would be a full-time occupation if I had. Of course, I bow to the telephone when I'm speaking to it in Japan, which is not a terrible thing. But I would certainly be happy to speak less and to speak more generically in certain ways. And again, I was mentioning Leonard Cohen, who was the most spellbinding and articulate writer I've ever met. And I remember one day I went to visit him at his house, which is a small house in a beat-up part of Los Angeles he shared with his daughter. And he'd been through 30 years of Zen practice. So although he hadn't spent much time in Japan, he'd really been schooling himself in those Japanese traditions. And we had lunch, and he spoke bewitchingly about politics and literature and the journey of the self, everything possible. And then at the end of the lunch, he gathered two little folding chairs, and he took them out to his garden, which looked out on a tiny bed of flowers and a quiet residential street. And we sat down, nothing. And I waited, nothing. More minutes passed, nothing. And finally, I thought, well, this is a gentle hint. So I said, I'm really sorry, you must be busy, I should leave you. And he looked at me beseeching. He said, no, please don't go. And I realized, maybe partly because of his Zen training, that he, the most eloquent of souls, realized that silence was the ultimate expression of trust and friendship. And it was fine to, as James was saying, have fun with ideas and throw words around over the lunch table and have a sparkling conversation. But really, the communion came just sitting quietly, looking at the flowers, saying nothing. So he had mastered that art, and I haven't, but it's one that I would love to learn from my Japanese neighbors. Sometimes people are surprised. I've lived with my wife 32 years. She speaks limited English. I speak more limited Japanese. But I always feel that words can be used as weapons. Words can be used as smokescreens, as diversions. And any of you who are in a relationship know that words can so often be used to wound another person or to create distances. Of course, silence can be aggressive too. But I find with my wife, because we have fewer words in common, when we're communicating, it's in a much clearer, more unclouded way, because I'm just trying to get the communication over from me to her, and vice versa. And I say facetiously, but it's genuinely true. I have fewer communications problems with my wife than I do in California, where there's the illusion of a common language, but actually the same word means very different things if you grow up in England and if you grow up in California. A couple of hands up there, I think.
Your observations about Japan, do they apply to the inner cities of Japan as well as the younger culture, the younger generation people?
Would they apply to the cities, did you say, or the...
People in cities.
In cities.
I think, so I live very close to the big cities of Nara and Osaka and Kobe and Kyoto. I think it would apply there. Tokyo might be less connected with its traditions. Young people is a very good question, because certainly on the surface, they're alarming their elders by seeming so Western in their ways. And as I say, much less committed to filial responsibility. They eat on the train. They don't tuck in their shirts. They affect the fashions of the West, but I think to their parents, maybe the values of the West too. At some level, that's the role of young people everywhere, to rebel against their parents until they find that they've become their parents. But it's certainly, your question is one that is urgent to many of my Japanese friends who would say that we're never going to be America, but we're not even Japan now. And if you read the novels of Haruki Murakami, they're all about loss of purpose, loss of self, loss of direction, living comfortable lives, but what are we living for? Where is our passion? We'll never be part of the West, but we've also moved too far away from our roots. My wife, when I met her, she was 30, and all she wanted to do was to come to California. Now she's half a lifetime older, and she's gone back to her roots, which I think one way or another, many of us do. Whether the Japanese will continue doing that, I'm not so sure. But I think Japan has done a startling job of remaining true to its foundations through thick and thin. If you look at the Meiji Restoration and the many convulsions of the 20th century, it was constantly changing its surfaces, and of course, prosecuting really aggressive ambitions across Asia. But at some level, if you read descriptions of Japan from 1890, it's almost shocking how perfectly they apply to today. So I'm not sure how much it's really changing. I think there's a hand right behind the person who just asked a question.
Thank you for coming. And I'm patron member of the Asia Society, Eiko Asel, and I'm Japanese. Many people misunderstood about the Japanese women's culture. We are much, much smarter and wisdom than gentlemen. I want to tell to Western people, because magazine, TV, and New York Times is writing, oh, Japanese women don't want to marry, don't want to make children. That's not true. You go to very traditional old family, they don't want you to divorce. Of course, then your family root will be no longer exist. So my grandmother and my mother always used to tell us, don't make your husband put down, stupid. If your husband's stupid, you become stupid. So even if you have a stupid husband, you have to make him like a king. Then you look good. That was old good family culture. And, we act like we walk behind of the husband, but that's very smart lady. It's not stupid person. More you go to walk and talk, put down husband, they are the stupid family. It is true. So, which country lady controls the entire financial thing and all the children's education? The Japanese wife controls everything. Husband go to work early morning, come back night time. Which country is that? So here, I hear from friends, oh, my husband bought for me this. We don't ask, we just buy in Japan. Huh? Question? I'm sorry, she asked me a question. I'm sorry, I should ask question, but I just, wanted to have this opportunity because many people have misunderstood about Japanese women. So thank you very much, and our culture has pride and shame. So that's very different from this country, and we don't brag ourselves. And I myself living here so long time, but my husband still don't understand me, and or American friend too. So, but we always modest, humble. That is a very important thing. So, if you are modest, humble, here they say, oh, you stupid person. That's what everybody thinks, but I'm not really stupid. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. There's a whole section on women in this beginner's guide, and of course, I'm not the person to be in a position to write it, but there's a lot about exactly what you were saying, and how women control all the finances and actually seem to have more fun and do more imaginative things with their lives, and wonder why their husbands are so glad to be stuck in the office while they're doing all kinds of fresher things.